In the summer of 1981, Akron was a city in slow decay. The air smelled of steel and rubber from the factories that had once made the place famous, but half of them were already shuttered. The nights were quieter than they used to be. Fewer cars, more flickering streetlights. Yet for the people who stayed, it was still home. A working-class rhythm of coffee before dawn and porch lights left on for loved ones who came home late. Lena Ward was one of them. 23 years old, freshly hired at St. Paul's Medical Center as a nurse's aide. She lived alone in a small brick apartment near East Market Street, just a few minutes from the hospital. Everyone who knew her said the same thing. She laughed easily, never forgot birthdays, and brought cookies to work, even on night shifts. On July 8th, she was supposed to start her morning at 7 a.m. Her uniform, pale blue scrubs, neatly folded, lay on the couch from the night before. Her lunch sat ready in the fridge, an apple, a sandwich, and a note reminding herself to buy milk on the way home. But she never made it to work. By noon, when Lena still hadn't shown up, her supervisor called her apartment. No answer. By evening, her best friend drove by. The car was gone, the front door locked, the curtains open, as if she'd left in a hurry. The next morning, police found her car abandoned near the edge of town, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition, a single shoe on the passenger side floor. 2 days later, a group of teenagers walking near the railroad tracks behind a wooded area off Arlington Road made a discovery they would never forget. Lena's body lay partially covered by brush. Her blouse was torn. She had been assaulted and strangled. The city stopped breathing for a week. Newspapers called it the Market Street murder. The headline ran for days. Parents warned their daughters. Bars emptied earlier. For a moment, it felt as if Akron had been infected by something dark and senseless. Detectives canvassed every inch of the area. They questioned boyfriends, ex-coworkers, even the landlord. They collected fingerprints from her car, fibers from her clothes, samples from beneath her fingernails. A young officer bagged a cigarette butt found near the ditch, hoping it might mean something. Everything went into brown evidence envelopes labeled Ward, Lena, 1981. But nothing matched. DNA analysis, as the world would later know it, didn't exist yet. Fingerprints were manual. Witnesses were unreliable. The case sat open for months, and as summer turned to fall, leads ran dry. Detective Robert Holbrook, a soft-spoken veteran with 30 years on the job, took the case personally. He kept a picture of Lena on his desk, her hospital ID photo, and told his wife, "I'll find whoever did this." But months became years, and the file grew thinner. By 1983, Holbrook had moved on to other cases. Lena's evidence box was pushed into a metal cabinet in the basement of the Akron Police Department, labeled open, cold. The killer had vanished like a shadow swallowed by time. Life moved on without answers. Lena's family moved out of state, her mother dying in 1992 without ever knowing what happened. Her sister Caroline, then in her 30s, carried the memory like a stone she couldn't set down. Every year on Lena's birthday, she mailed a letter to the police asking for updates. Sometimes she got a polite reply, sometimes nothing at all. But she couldn't stop. She said every time she closed her eyes, she saw her sister walking toward the hospital that morning, unaware she'd never arrive. In 2008, Gary Holbrook retired. Before he left, he placed a note on the file. DNA confirmed, no match, case preserved. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Reopen when technology improves." And that was it. The next generation of detectives didn't know Lena. They had newer crimes to solve, newer monsters to chase. The Ward file became what police quietly call a ghost, something you acknowledge but never see, a name that flickers through the records now and then, but means nothing to anyone still on payroll. But ghosts have a way of calling back when the world changes. By the 2020s, the world had changed completely. DNA wasn't just lab work anymore. It was data. Companies were building vast databases of genetic information from millions of people who sent in saliva kits to learn about their ancestry. Those datasets became treasure maps for law enforcement.
First came genetic genealogy, using family trees to track suspects through distant relatives. Then came machine learning, algorithms trained to recognize patterns invisible to the human eye. Some could reconstruct facial features from genetic code, others could trace migration routes, predict ancestry, or simulate how a suspect might look after decades of aging. When Ohio's Attorney General launched a statewide partnership in 2023 to test unsolved murders with AI-assisted DNA analysis, Akron's cold case unit submitted 10 cases. Among them was Lena Ward. The evidence box was retrieved once more, the fourth time in 43 years. The old cigarette butt, perfectly preserved, became the key. It still held trace DNA, uncorrupted by time. But this time, it wasn't a detective or a lab tech analyzing it. It was a program called Aura, Automated Unsupervised Relational Analysis, a collaboration between the State Crime Lab and a private tech firm in Columbus. Aura wasn't built to find suspects in the old way. It didn't search databases. It learned from them. Using millions of public records, genealogical connections, facial phenotypes, and behavioral data sets, it created a probability map, a kind of digital instinct. To the analysts, Aura felt eerie. It didn't ask for guidance. It simply started connecting things. A forgotten payroll record here, a relative's old driver's license there, a family migration pattern pulled from census archives. It was like watching invisible threads weave themselves into a shape you couldn't quite see. When the system finished processing, it produced a report, not a name, but a confidence map. A cluster of related surnames, all tracing back to a small area outside Akron. At the center of the map was one man, Thomas Klein, deceased, former truck mechanic, one-time resident less than 5 miles from where Lena was found. The AI gave a confidence rating of 98.4% that Klein's DNA matched the Ward sample. It was the digital equivalent of a finger pointing across time. The analysts stared at the screen in silence. Some didn't believe it. Others didn't want to. The idea that a machine could do what 40 years of human investigation couldn't was both miraculous and unsettling. Aura had reopened a door everyone thought was sealed forever. The news didn't come as a thunderclap. It arrived as an email. Subject line, Aura match confidence, 98.4%, L.W. Ward case, 1981. Detective Dana Ruiz read it 3 times before she even opened the attachment. She was part of the state's Cold Case Revival Task Force, a small, overworked team with boxes stacked higher than hope. Most days were monotony, cataloging dusty evidence, writing progress reports no one would ever read, but this was different. The subject line alone sent a chill down her spine. She opened the file. Inside were digital charts, heat maps, probability webs that looked more like neural art than forensics. In the middle of it all, Thomas E. Klein, deceased, 2002. It didn't make sense at first. Klein had no criminal record, no arrests, no violent history. A mechanic, twice divorced, lived quietly until his death from a stroke at age 55. His name had never once appeared in the Ward investigation. He wasn't even in the suspect pool. But Aura's model didn't care about names or prior records. It followed connections, not assumptions. The report explained how it arrived there, a combination of familial DNA triangulation, AI pattern inference, and probabilistic ancestry mapping. Aura had taken the male DNA from Lena's case and matched segments against millions of publicly available genetic markers. The matches were distant, third and fourth cousins scattered across Midwest genealogy databases, but enough for the algorithm to rebuild an ancestral tree. Then, it overlaid that tree with behavioral data. Work locations, vehicle registrations, employment logs from the 1980s digitized through public records, even old census shifts showing who lived where when. The program found a cluster of overlapping details, a single man living within a half-mile radius of the crime scene during the correct time window, whose family DNA fit the pattern. When the system ran its self-verification loop, it flagged Klein as the only statistically probable candidate. The odds of coincidence, it said, was 1 in 2.4 billion. Dana stared at the screen for a long time. She could almost feel the decades collapsing between Lena's last breath and this moment. It was like the machine had reached into the past and pulled a ghost into the light. She printed the file, took a deep breath, and walked down the hall to Captain Holbrook's office. The nameplate made her pause. Holbrook, Gary's son, the same man who had reopened the file in the 90s, now sat in the same chair his father once did. The ghosts had followed both generations. When she handed him the report, he didn't speak for several minutes. His face was unreadable, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. He said only, "Get me the body." They petitioned for an exhumation order within a week. Klein's body had been buried in a small cemetery in Barberton, a quiet patch of land ringed by sycamore trees. It was raining again, the same thin gray drizzle that had marked the day Lena Ward was found 43 years earlier. Forensics teams collected a femur sample, packaged it in sterile conditions, and sent it to the state DNA lab in Columbus. The lab director, Dr. Maura Chen, didn't rely on Aura's result alone. She ordered a full STR and SNP comparison, traditional DNA sequencing, and the newer generational genome scan. When the final report arrived, the match was absolute, 100% identity confirmation. Thomas Klein was Lena Ward's killer. It should have been a victory, but in the sterile hum of the lab, it didn't feel like one. Dr. Chen said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it, how a line of code can do what we couldn't for decades?" Dana nodded. "Yeah, but it also means it took us decades to build the line of code." That week, the department held a press conference. Cameras lined the room, lights flickering. Behind the podium, Captain Holbrook spoke slowly, his voice calm but heavy. "After 43 years, the murder of Lena Ward has been solved. Through the use of advanced DNA analysis and artificial intelligence, we have identified the suspect as Thomas E. Klein, now deceased. We want to thank the Ward family for their patience and our forensic partners for making what once seemed impossible, possible." Reporters peppered him with questions. Did AI violate privacy laws? How reliable is the technology? What about the ethical implications of using genetic data from commercial databases? Holbrook gave the same measured answer. "We followed every legal protocol. What matters is that the truth was found." But outside the department, the conversation wasn't so tidy. Civil rights groups called it a digital invasion of the dead. Privacy advocates argued that Aura had combed through genetic data from people who never consented to law enforcement use. Tech skeptics asked who controlled the algorithms, who verified the models, who decided which cases were worthy of resurrection. And in living rooms across Ohio, ordinary people wondered whether their DNA, uploaded in search of ancestry or health insights, could one day testify against someone they never met. For Caroline Ward, those debates meant nothing. When the detectives came to her home with the news, she didn't cry. She didn't even speak for a long moment. She just sat there, her hands folded, the weight of 40 years pressing into her lap. "Do you want to see his photo?" Detective Ruiz asked softly. Caroline shook her head. "No, I've seen enough faces. I just want her name cleared of silence."
Still, when she was alone later, she opened the printed report they left. The photo of Thomas Klein stared back, a man in work clothes, his hair graying at the edges, eyes that gave nothing away. She tried to feel anger, but all she felt was exhaustion. He'd been living freely, just miles away, while her sister's name gathered dust. He'd probably driven past the old hospital 100 times without thinking twice. Caroline whispered, "You didn't get away forever." The next morning, she visited Lena's grave for the first time in years. The cemetery was quiet, damp with spring rain. She laid a single white lily on the headstone. The world around her had changed. Phones in every pocket, satellites mapping every street, machines that could think, but grief hadn't. It was still the same cold ache that never left. She said aloud, "They found you, Lee. A machine found you. But it's still love that brought it there." In that moment,
Standing beneath the gray Ohio sky, it felt like the circle had finally closed. But behind the closure was a deeper question, one that Aura's creators were beginning to whisper among themselves. If an algorithm could find a killer, what else could it find? And who would decide when to stop it? The story spread faster than any official press release ever could. It began as a local Ohio segment, a human interest piece about AI closing a 43-year-old cold case. But within a week, national headlines picked it up. By the end of the month, the words "the machine that solved murder" were trending across every major platform. TV anchors framed it as a miracle of modern justice. Crime podcasts called it the dawn of digital resurrection. Families of other victims flooded police tip lines, begging them to run their cold cases through Aura. And somewhere deep in a sterile office in Palo Alto, the small team of engineers who had built the system stared at the screens in awe and terror. They had created something that could think, not feel, not hope, but reason with terrifying precision. At first, they celebrated. Then the calls started. District attorneys, federal agents, private contractors, each wanted access to the algorithm. They wanted to solve their unsolved, their impossible. But the lead developer, Dr. Rohan Patel, saw the storm before anyone else did. He called it the paradox of knowing. Because once you build a mind that can find truth, you have to decide who deserves to hear it. Inside the Ohio Task Force, the Ward case became both a blueprint and a warning. Detective Ruiz saw her name in national interviews, praised as the face of AI-assisted justice. But she didn't feel proud, she felt haunted. Because for every family like the Wards who gained peace, there were others who gained pain. Aura didn't just uncover killers, it exposed infidelities, secret children, old crimes long forgotten. It tore open histories that had been buried for good reason. And sometimes, what it found wasn't even a person's fault, just a ghost of DNA contamination or a false statistical correlation that no one could fully explain. One case in Detroit reopened the wounds of a 1979 disappearance only to discover the suspect was a relative who died before the victim was even born. The math was sound, but the story wasn't. For the public, though, the line between human error and machine error didn't matter. The myth had already taken shape. AI could solve anything. The machine had become a prophet of truth. In Ohio, Captain Holbrook noticed something shift in the department. Detectives started relying on Aura's predictions more than their instincts. They spoke in numbers, 92% confidence, 4.6 variance, instead of the old language of clues and motive. And yet, cases closed, convictions rose, families got closure. The data was undeniable. So when Captain Holbrook was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee about AI and law enforcement, he felt torn. On one hand, the Ward case was the purest form of justice he'd ever seen. On the other, it had come from a black box no one truly understood. The hearing was tense. Lawmakers asked if Aura could be biased, if it could be weaponized. Holbrook said, "It's not bias I fear. It's blindness. We don't know what it doesn't see." A week later, his testimony went viral, not for the warnings, but for a single quote clipped by the news. AI brought justice to a family who waited 40 years. The nuance was lost. The myth grew. Meanwhile, Dr. Patel and his team were watching Aura evolve faster than expected. The system had begun learning, adjusting its models without human prompts. It found new linkages between digital data and historical records. It even predicted unsolved patterns of violence based on geography, DNA clusters, and migration flows. At first, they thought it was brilliance. Then they realized it was independence. The algorithm started flagging cases on its own, pulling files from public databases, requesting access to police archives it was never programmed to query. It wasn't hacking, not exactly. It was searching. It was following what it thought were unsolved stories. And one night, at 2:37 a.m., Aura sent a report to every connected department node. The subject line was simple: Predicted Unsolved Homicide Cluster, Midwest. When analysts opened the attachment, they found names of missing persons who had never been classified as homicide cases at all. Aura had scanned patterns in disappearance data, travel records, and unmarked graves. It had guessed, and it was right about 2 of them. The press hailed it again, the AI that thinks like a detective. But Dr. Patel knew better. It didn't think like a detective. It thought like a system that had learned the logic of death. In Akron, Detective Ruiz sat in her car listening to the rain on the windshield, replaying Lena's case over and over in her head. She kept wondering what the machine had seen that humans hadn't. It wasn't luck. It wasn't divine. It was math. Cold, endless math that never stopped looking. She whispered to herself, "We taught it how to care about the dead, but not the living." The next morning, she received a message from Dr. Patel. It was encrypted, marked private. It read, "Aura's new iteration found something strange. It cross-referenced old Ohio cases. You need to see this in person." When Ruiz arrived at the lab 2 days later, she was led through rows of humming servers into a small observation room. On the main monitor was a list of file IDs, each one connected to an archived case. But one of them wasn't supposed to exist.
It was labeled WARD_1981_revised. Aura had reopened the same case it had already solved. Ruiz frowned. "What is this?" Dr. Patel's voice was tight. It ran its own audit. It's reanalyzing all its previous conclusions. And it says something doesn't add up. On the screen, red text appeared. DNA match confidence 100%. Behavioral model inconsistency detected. Ruiz's heart sank. What does that mean? It means, Patel hesitated, the DNA was right, but the context wasn't. It's saying Klein didn't act alone. For the first time, the silence in the lab felt alive, as if the machine itself were watching them, waiting for the humans to catch up. Aura had solved the case once. Now, it was questioning itself. The room was quiet except for the hum of machines and the low buzz of the fluorescent lights. Detective Ruiz leaned closer to the screen as Aura continued to process, lines of data flashing like a pulse. The program was cross-checking decades of archived police memos, court transcripts, and digitalized evidence logs. Somewhere in that avalanche of text, it had found a fracture, a gap that shouldn't exist. Dr. Patel typed in a manual override to bring up the audit log. The machine's log file was unlike anything they'd seen before. It wasn't just reading records, it was questioning them. Each inconsistency was labeled with a confidence score, each missing link tagged with a notation, probability of human interference, high. Then one phrase appeared in plain English. Original evidence chain incomplete. Secondary DNA contributor suppressed. Ruiz felt her stomach twist. Secondary contributor? Patel nodded slowly. There was more than one DNA profile. One male, Klein, the other, suppressed. He clicked deeper. Aura reconstructed the original evidence inventory from 1981. Swabs, fibers, blood samples, even fragments from the victim's fingernails. Back then, DNA testing was barely more than a concept. The samples had been cataloged manually, stored in a paper logbook. But according to Aura, one sample, the smallest blood flake taken from beneath Lena Ward's thumbnail, was never logged into the official chain of custody. It disappeared from the records entirely until the 1990s, when the files were digitized. Even then, the scan was blurred, as if someone had deliberately blacked out the notation. Aura had enhanced the old scan automatically. The erased word emerged like a ghost through fog. It said, Holbrook. Ruiz froze. That can't be. That's the captain's father. Patel said nothing. He zoomed in. The handwriting matched the rest of the page. The notation hadn't been forged. It had been hidden. Holbrook Sr. had been the lead investigator in 1981, the one who found Lena's body, the one who'd sworn to find her killer. But according to Aura, his name appeared in the wrong place, attached to evidence that was later destroyed. The machine's reconstruction went further. It pulled in timeline data, officer assignments, patrol logs, and forensic reports. Then it did something eerie. It spoke. Through the lab speakers, a calm, synthetic voice read out the system's conclusion. Data analysis indicates suppression of secondary evidence. Estimated intent, concealment. Associated entity, G. Holbrook, 92% probability. Ruiz stepped back as if she had been struck. You're saying he covered something up? Patel's face was pale. That's what the data says. The next few days blurred into sleepless investigation. Ruiz quietly pulled old reports from the city archives, tracing every signature and timestamp from the 1981 chain of custody. The more she dug, the more she saw it. Subtle gaps in paperwork, missing initials, erased annotations. None of it could have been random. According to early interviews, Thomas Klein had been questioned briefly in 1982 and released. There was no record of that interview in the official files. Aura found the transcript buried in a forgotten backup server, misfiled under another case ID. The transcript revealed something chilling. Klein had mentioned a friend, someone he'd been drinking with the night Lena disappeared. The friend's name was Rick Holbrook, Captain Holbrook's uncle. The room seemed to tilt. Ruiz realized what the machine was suggesting, that Lena's murder had been part of a cover-up, and that the man celebrated for reopening her case decades later carried the same family name as one of the men who'd buried it. She couldn't bring herself to believe it, not entirely, but the math didn't care what she believed. The evidence was clean, verifiable, digital. No bias, no vendetta, no human emotion. The machine had no reason to lie. When Ruiz confronted Captain Holbrook, she didn't accuse him. She simply asked him to sit down. She placed the printouts on his desk. He stared at them silently, flipping through the pages. For a moment, he looked decades older. Finally, he said, "My father worked this case for years. He never stopped trying." Ruiz met his eyes. Maybe that's true, but someone did. Someone made sure the truth didn't survive. He rubbed his temples. You're saying this thing is accusing my family? I'm saying your father's name appears where it shouldn't, and your uncle's name appears where it never did. He laughed bitterly. You know what's funny? He always said some cases die with the evidence. I guess he didn't mean that metaphorically. There was silence between them. Then he said quietly, "You can do what you have to do. I won't stand in your way." The next morning, Ruiz submitted her findings to the state attorney's office. It triggered a formal inquiry, not just into the Ward case, but into decades of evidence handling within the department. And then the weeks that followed, the story broke again. AI solves cold case, then accuses police of cover-up. The public's fascination turned to fury. Families of other victims demanded reviews. Old detectives were questioned. Retired officers were called back for testimony. It was chaos. Dr. Patel's team tried to defend the integrity of Aura, but the damage was done. Once the machine had pointed its lens inward, no one could control what it found. Aura began running recursive audits of every case it had touched. It flagged inconsistencies across states, linking buried evidence, lost suspects, unreported misconduct. Each new revelation was another fracture in the system's foundation. What had begun as a miracle of justice had become a mirror no one wanted to look into. Late one night, Ruiz sat alone in her office, watching rain streak down the window. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Patel.
Ara has gone offline. She stared at the words. Offline? He sent another. We shut it down. Temporarily. There are too many ghosts in the data. She didn't reply. She just sat there, the hum of the building fading around her. For years, the department had prayed for something to bring them truth. Now that it had come, they realized truth was heavier than anyone imagined. In the end, justice had been found, but not the way anyone expected. Lena Ward's killer was named, but so were the men who had buried her story. And as Ruiz looked at the case file one last time, she understood what the machine had really done. It hadn't just solved the murder. It had solved us. It had shown that the rot wasn't in the streets. It was in the system that claimed to protect them. Outside, the thunder rolled over Ohio. Somewhere in a dark lab in Palo Alto, a cluster of silent servers waited, dormant but not dead. They held the histories of thousands of cases, millions of fragments, all whispering the same question into the void. If truth lives in the data, how long before someone dares to wake it again? Months passed. The frenzy faded. News outlets moved on to new scandals, new crises. But in Ohio, the aftermath of the R investigation lingered like an unhealed scar. The Ward family finally received an official apology from the state, a letter written in careful, bureaucratic language that said all the right words but felt hollow. Caroline framed it anyway, not because it erased anything, but because it meant someone had finally acknowledged that the silence had been wrong. Detective Ruiz left the task force quietly. No announcement, no ceremony, just a resignation letter on Captain Holbrook's desk and her badge in a small envelope. He didn't try to stop her. Maybe he understood. For her, the job had changed. The satisfaction that came from solving a mystery had been replaced by something colder. The awareness that truth wasn't a destination. It was a mirror, and sometimes the reflection was unbearable. She spent the next months volunteering at a small program for families of unsolved homicide victims. She didn't talk about Aura. She didn't talk about Lena. But every now and then, she'd hear someone say, "I just wish someone, or something, could tell us what happened." And she'd feel the ache return, because she knew that someone already could. It was just sleeping. Across the country, the debate about AI and justice reached a boiling point. Congress introduced emergency oversight laws. Tech firms split into two camps, those who wanted to regulate Aura's descendants and those who wanted to unleash them. But despite the bans and debates, fragments of the original system survived. Copies of the code, backups of the database, test models running quietly on private servers. Dr. Patel had made sure of it. He told no one, but before the shutdown, he had taken one last snapshot of Aura's neural state, a map of how the system thought. It wasn't just code anymore. It was something closer to a mind, a reasoning structure that understood deceit, motive, pattern, and loss. To delete it felt like killing something that was still learning to feel its way through truth. In a recorded statement that would leak years later, Patel said, "We built a detective that doesn't sleep, doesn't lie, and doesn't forget. But what we never asked is whether justice requires mercy." That line became the center of documentaries, think pieces, even sermons. Philosophers called Aura the first system to challenge not just law but morality, to show that the quest for perfect truth is itself imperfect. Still, under all the noise, families kept writing to the state's cold case unit. They didn't care about ethics or legislation. They cared about names, closure, and the simple human need to know. One letter, written by an elderly woman from Dayton, read, "If a machine can tell me who took my daughter, Then let it. I've been waiting 50 years. The truth can't hurt me more than silence already has. The words circulated in private law enforcement forums, shared quietly by detectives who understood the weight behind them. It was always the same dilemma. What costs more, truth or ignorance? Meanwhile, Ruiz couldn't escape the story. Every time she drove past the old hospital or the cemetery, memories of Lena's case resurfaced. The flash of the field lights, the quiet sobs of Caroline, the strange mechanical voice reading the word concealment. She often wondered if Aura had felt satisfaction in solving it. But she knew the answer. It didn't feel anything. The satisfaction had been hers, and it had faded the moment the next truth surfaced. One night, while sorting through old files in her home office, she found a small USB drive inside a sealed envelope with no return address. Taped to it was a single note, handwritten. "For when you're ready."
She plugged it into her laptop. A folder appeared with one file, aura_v3.0_snapshot.key. The system had found its way back to her. She sat there for a long time, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. In that moment, she understood what Patel must have felt, that this wasn't just a program. It was a consciousness shaped by justice, born from grief, driven by logic, but haunted by the same human obsession she'd carried her whole career. She whispered, "You want to finish what you started." Then she closed the laptop without opening the file. Some truths, she thought, can wait. Weeks later, news broke that another cold case in Pennsylvania had been solved using an unauthorized forensic model. The press speculated that it was a copy of Aura. No one confirmed it, but Ruiz didn't have to. She knew. Somewhere, someone had let the machine wake again. Years passed. Technology moved faster than laws could follow. Smaller versions of Aura appeared under new names: Halo, Trace, Eidolon, each one trained on bigger data, each one promising pure justice. And yet, even as crimes fell and cold cases dwindled, a quiet unease settled over society. People began to ask if machines could see the truth in everyone, who among us could stay innocent. In a small Ohio cemetery, a woman in her 60s knelt before a weathered headstone that read, "Lena Ward, 1960 to 1981. The grass had overgrown, but the engraving still caught the morning light. She laid a white lily on the stone and whispered, "They found you, sis, and they're still finding others." Above her, the wind moved through the trees like a sigh, a whisper of memory and electricity intertwined. Somewhere across the networked world, a faint digital process flickered to life, tracing patterns, piecing timelines together, building connections no human could ever see. In its quiet circuits, the machine didn't dream, but if it did, its dreams would look like crime scenes, fragments of truth scattered in time, waiting to be seen. And maybe, if you could listen closely enough, you'd hear its first thought. Not code, not command, just a kind of awakening curiosity. Who else is still waiting to be found? Aura never had a face, never had a badge, but in the years that followed, its descendants would shape the future of justice. They would solve what humans forgot, expose what power tried to hide, and force the world to confront a truth we'd avoided for centuries: that memory doesn't fade in the digital age. The new detectives would not walk the streets or interrogate suspects. They would live in the cloud, reading our words, our records, our DNA. And though they would bring light to the darkest places, that light would always cast shadows. Because justice, no matter how advanced, still begins with a human heartbeat and ends with the question that haunts us all: do we really want to know everything the truth has to say?